Okay, well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, to those of you who are present here tonight in Brisbane CBD, holding Redlick, and also to those of you who are present online. There's quite a number of you also present online. Welcome to another Australian Institute of International Affairs event. I'm Paul Lucas. I'm the State President of the AIIA, and can I both welcome you all here, but can I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Yagara and the Turrbal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Tonight, last year we had the Ukrainian ambassador to Australia, Vasil Miroshnichenko, who delivered a wonderful talk to us. And so it is wonderful again that this year we have Roman Waschuk speak to us. Now, I'm not going to introduce Roman to you because I'm going to have Melissa O'Rourke, the State Director of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, who deserves acknowledgement in her own right, but who was posted to Ukraine and so knows both the country but Roman very well. I just will make this one observation, that Roman, of course, well, not of course, Roman is ethnically Ukrainian, but he is also a Canadian, and he was the Canadian ambassador to Ukraine. One thing I won't get into explain tonight is why Canada is the Dominion of Canada and Australia is a Commonwealth of Australia. I don't understand why myself. In any event, that's not what we're going to talk about. So, Melissa, can you please introduce Roman? He's going to speak, do a presentation, and we'll take questions thereafter.
Thanks very much, Paul. And yeah, I'm not sure there's that much left to say, but yeah. So as Paul indicated, Melissa O'Rourke, I'm the Queensland State Director for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. My former role before coming up here was actually I was Australia's ambassador to Ukraine from 2017 to 2020. So that is how I was fortunate enough to cross paths with both Roman and Oksana. You would have seen from his CV that he has had a very distinguished career, notably with the Canadian Foreign Service, and was very much an expert in Eastern Europe. In addition to Kiev, he was also posted to Moscow, to Berlin. He was a Canadian ambassador to Serbia with accreditation to a couple of other countries from 2011. And then in 2014, he began what ended up being, I think, about a 5-year stint as the Canadian ambassador to Ukraine. Unlike Australia, Canada has a much larger relationship with Ukraine on a historical basis that's driven by the diaspora, because the Canadian diaspora numbers more than 1 million people, is my understanding, whereas here in Australia, we're more around the 46,000, I believe, in the last census. So for Canada, Ukraine has always loomed large in their foreign policy and has very much been a priority. Indeed, in recent times, there was a foreign minister who went on to be deputy prime minister who had Canadian heritage, and I believe she's still a member of the government now.
Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
So for Canada, Ukraine has always loomed large, and there's an extensive people-to-people, business, defence and other ties. In terms of how I came across Roman, you may not know, but the Australian Embassy in Ukraine was actually co-located with the Canadian Embassy, so we were tenants in his building. And indeed, he played an integral part in the establishment of the Australian Embassy in Ukraine. We had, in the Canadian Embassy, I mean, we had previously covered it from Warsaw. And we were looking after the tragic events of July 2014 with the downing of MH17. We were very much looking to scale up our relationship with Ukraine, and from the beginning, Roman was a very enthusiastic supporter of having the Australian Embassy be part of the Canadian Embassy. It was actually the first time we'd done that sort of co-location. So he very much was a friend to Australia from the get-go. Also because his lovely wife, Oksana, is Australian. So I will let him fill you in more detail in terms of his role, but I think that it's very interesting that having escaped Ukraine and entered retirement in 2019, or the late 2019, Obviously, we had the tragic events that have been impacting on Ukraine since Russia's invasion in February 2022. And Roman, obviously being a passionate member of the diaspora and so committed to the country, very much wanted to go back to Ukraine and make a contribution. So when the president came knocking and said, how about being Ukraine's business ombudsman? He said, sure, sign me up. So he's actually travelled here to Brisbane via Cairns with some lost luggage, but came directly from Kiev. So he actually has first-hand knowledge of how it is to be living in Ukraine at the moment, what the local situation is, and of course, with his role as business ombudsman, very much looking to the future, to reconstruction, to how we can get things moving again once we manage to find a way through this awful conflict. So I will leave it there, but I very much hope that you enjoy tonight's discussion because we really are fortunate to be in the company of a real Ukraine expert. So Roman, hand over to you.
Well, very happy to be here with all of you both live here in Brisbane and online. Now, do I move these slides ahead just by pressing?
Yes.
Like this, yes.
Wow.
So here we go. Just to kind of give you context, orders of magnitude. Ukraine, because I know that in countries like Canada and Australia, people tend to believe that European countries are all tiny. They're small. They're a bit bigger than the Grand Duchy of Fenwick, but maybe from the mouse that roared, but not a whole lot. So Ukraine, though, is big by European standards. So Ukraine is about 25 Belgiums. Ukraine has 25 regions, and each one of them is pretty much the size of a Belgium-type European country. So that it is actually the biggest country territorially to be entirely within Europe. Russia, of course, is bigger, but extends across the Eurasian landmass, and Russia is also trying to change the size of Ukraine in a very active and unpleasant way. On the other hand, so big by European standards, on the other hand, you could pretty much fit 3 Ukraines into Queensland. What is that? What is the takeaway from these orders of magnitude? It means that Ukraine is actually big enough to absorb both military and economic flows and relocate defense capabilities, industry, etc., or even the growing of certain key products or emblematic products. Those of you who have been following the conflict will know that in the European fall of 2022, Ukraine liberated the right bank of Kherson region, which is on the southern stretch of the Dnipro River. That was the traditional watermelon growing capital of Ukraine. There used to be an annual barge going up the river from Kherson with watermelons. Needless to say, the landmine and artillery shell soaked soil of Kherson is not particularly apt for watermelons right now. But as I said, Ukraine, by Ukrainian standards, is big enough that you basically watermelon production moved from down here to down there along the Danube. So from the Dnipro, lower reaches of the Dnipro to the lower reaches of the Danube. And so now when you go to a Ukrainian supermarket, you have big boxes of watermelon coming from a producer called Predunayski Ahrari, i.e. agrarians of the lower Danube. So so that means Ukraine is more resilient than most people would have expected from outside, and explains why it has been able to adapt and survive so far. Secondly, Ukraine, shall we say, was not a household word among global economic titans until recently. But it was in its own way a key component of the global economic architecture, especially in food production. So Ukraine was historically known as a breadbasket of Europe. I had a UN World Food Program person tell me Ukraine was our global supermarket. When we needed to get grains or flour or sunflower oil for our various WFP programs, Ukraine is the first place we went to. Reasonable prices, easy logistics, ready supply. But it is also a brain basket in the sense that Ukraine has Europe's largest cadre of software engineers and programmers. This comes from a very strong background, polytechnics and other mathematical and engineering schools. It means that it is quite likely that in the phones that we all stare at for far too long, a number of the apps you're working with probably are fully or partially Ukrainian generated. I don't know if any of you use Grammarly to check and upgrade your English. Grammarly is actually a Ukrainian product. And the two co-inventors of Grammarly are now in the Forbes top 10 richest Ukrainians, where they have displaced traditional oligarchs. So basically the brain basket side of Ukraine is displacing the old style, heavy industry oriented oligarch side of Ukraine. So Ukraine is a key bulk commodity and IT outsourced supplier, but suffered from low global brand awareness. Now, obviously getting invaded is a tragic way of increasing global brand awareness, but there you have it. I mean, Ukraine has become much better known, but it's become known for suffering and tragedy and maybe a little bit of resilience. So what I'm going to try to tell you in this talk about in this presentation is that there's more to it than just pain and suffering and smoldering ruins. Again, not 80% of the country is not smoldering ruins. It's operating on a more or less normal basis if you include within your definition of normal the occasional ballistic missile or drone attack on your neighboring or yours or your neighbor's facility. Ukraine is also not the same as Russia. Now, fans of Tucker Carlson and his interview might well say, well, wait a minute. President Putin just told us that they're exactly the same. In fact, he handed over a file of documents from 1654 that conclusively shows something. Well, no. Let's maybe not go back to 862 or 1654, though they are fascinating dates, and I can go on forever if you'd like. Let's maybe just go back to 1991. Ukraine has had 6 presidents who have been elected in competitive elections, which means the previous president has lost and gone away. Also something a Trumpist like Carlson might not understand. Losing gracefully is not maybe in the repertoire, but in Ukraine it's happened. When they failed to do that, there have been revolutions. There was the Orange Revolution of 2004, and the Revolution of Dignity, or the Euromaidan of 2013-2014, which is just before my latest stint in Ukraine as ambassador started. There's actually a previous pre-revolution, if you will, in 1990 called the Granite Revolution, a student revolt in downtown Kiev. So one of the things is that Ukrainians have developed a tradition of standing up for themselves, standing up for their rights, as opposed to passively shrugging and saying, the Tsar has got it all figured out. What can we little people do? The Ukrainian response is all the little people get together and organize and make sure that whoever's in charge takes notice of what they want. What that's resulted in is a kind of economically a sort of a sputtering transition. that's had acceleration periods and then deceleration periods, with a contentious oligarchy. In a peculiar way, Ukrainian oligarchy has actually been a plus for pluralism, because no oligarch has wanted any other oligarch to have complete control. So whenever somebody looks like they might be getting too all-powerful, everybody else balances against them and brings them back down to size. But this oligarchy, in turn, has been sidelined by new contenders. I mentioned the IT people who are taking over the Forbes top 10 in Ukraine, small and medium enterprises, there are millions of them in Ukraine, and you'll recall Schumpeter and creative destruction as an economic theory. Well, in Ukraine, it's literal destruction. So if you were worried about Ukraine's biggest oligarch, Rinat Akhmetov, and his big steel-producing plants in Mariupol, well, they've literally been destroyed in the battle for Mariupol, Azovstal becoming a symbol of Ukrainian defense, and a number of other facilities. So there has been a shift from the southeast as the traditional sort of anchor of the Ukrainian economy to the center and the west, with some companies literally relocating and others just rebalancing their portfolios and moving closer to the EU border, the EU now being Ukraine's biggest economic partner. We'll talk a bit more of that. Meanwhile, back in Russia, a little-known country somewhere north of Ukraine, there have been 3 presidents: Yeltsin, Putin, Medvedev, Putin, in managed transitions. No competitive election where one guy had to actually say, "I've lost, ciao." And you've had growth fueled by petrochemicals with tamed oligarchs. People were wondering, war broke out, it's 2022, it's February, what will the oligarchs say? And the answer is nothing, because they have all, he's got the goods on them, and they have all been kind of whipped into obedience. So let's see if we can do another slide. Here it is. Ukraine and its business environment. Who are these people apart from me? They are the rest of my team at the Business Ombudsman Council. So what is our organization, and what has brought me back to Ukraine at what is, from a strictly risk management point of view, a bit of an ill-advised time period from January 2022. It's an office created in 2014 after the Euromaidan revolution to bring more openness and transparency to business issues, to level the playing field for all sorts of companies. So we take complaints and act on them from the smallest of one-person proprietor companies to the biggest of either Ukrainian companies, including some of the oligarch companies, and big Western companies, Shell, Philip Morris, and others. What it has meant, the foundation of this office, and it's had 3 expat business ombudsmen. I'm the 3rd. The first one was a Lithuanian former European commissioner, statistician by background, so we have a very well-developed case management statistical system. The second was a former Polish minister and mayor of Warsaw, and then I'm the 3rd since January of 22. What that means is that Ukraine is willing to be measured by international standards. It doesn't say, our business environment is none of your business. It allows somebody like me to be an active player and participant in calling out either overzealousness or wrongdoing or passivity on the part of government officials. And we tackle legacy challenges. A fiscal system that remains partly predatory, selective law enforcement, as well as outmoded regulations that tend to strangle business in certain segments. But we have a young, as you can see, positively ancient by comparison with most of my team of people who are either Western educated or Western program educated, and are very serious about the work they do. 2/3 of our team are lawyers, and they basically work through cases, crunch through cases, and take them through various administrative appeal processes. We are a pre-judicial and post-judicial entity, so we don't get mixed up in court cases. As soon as it goes to court, we're out. But as long as it's in a, let's say you're appealing administratively a tax decision, we are representing you in talking to the government about, let's say, having a fine that's been levied unfairly reversed. So what has an organization like ours been able to do? We've looked at about 13,000 cases of state and municipal malpractice since 2015. We've resolved 61% successfully for our clients. We've managed to get $700 million US dollars returned. The figure would have been higher before devaluation. The Ukrainian currency would have been about $1 billion, but it's still 700 million. Returned to business clients from government coffers. Western donors, and we're funded by the multi-donor account and the European Union through the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. If you put those two figures together, the donors have received a return on investment in terms of effect of 43-1. And those of you who have worked on international development projects will know that it's kind of hard in most cases to quantify in terms like this, but there you go. Who do we help? People say, you're funded by donors, so you're probably just helping foreign companies. Nope. We primarily help Ukrainian-owned companies, 85%. And you probably only help big companies. Well, mostly no. 2/3 of our clients are SMEs. And I know Australia has its own small and family business ombudsman. I might be meeting that person in Canberra. So very interested to see what some of the comparative experiences might be. So yeah, here's all sorts of stuff on what we do. A lot of it's very technocratic. And part of what I've been trying to do in working with my lawyers is telling them, speak human. Communicate in ways that, first of all, I understand. Not being a lawyer, sorry, let's move that back. And in ways that business people and politicians can understand. But we've managed to make major progress in construction permitting. It used to be a big problem in Ukraine, getting construction permits. In 2023, I think we do not have a single complaint about construction permitting. The system has been completely changed. It's been put online, it's digitized, and so that has eliminated, that has disappeared. We've been working with the Ukrainian Ministry of Infrastructure, now known as the Ministry of Renewal, on taking a sort of preventive approach to how they put together their project management systems for reconstruction projects. In other words, trying to draw on our experience of cases of what could go wrong so that they can build a more robust framework so fewer things go wrong when reconstruction starts in earnest. It's already started de facto because those areas, for example, the areas north, east of Kyiv, parts of Kharkiv Oblast that were liberated in 2022, there are already projects going on there to rebuild schools, rebuild roads, etc. So reconstruction of Ukraine is not just a future-oriented maybe thing. It's something that's actually happening now, even as hostilities continue in those areas where it's safe to do so. Oops. So what's happened with the Ukrainian economy overall? Because it's very nice that we have all these bureaucratic things we do and technocratic things we do, but the overall economy is much bigger than just us at business. You can see super shock in early 2022, but then a rebound. Now that doesn't mean, that means that growth has gone back to first double digit in quarterly terms and then annualized 5% in 2023. It doesn't mean the level has been re-achieved. We're basically still lower than in 2021. So we're in a kind of a hole, but it progressively moving up in terms of digging Ukraine out from that. The World Bank reconstruction needs estimate, and it's already months out of date, is at US dollars 411 billion. Now that is a lot. This is one of the reasons why it's unrealistic to expect that taxpayers in friendly countries will pay for all of this. It's one of the reasons why Ukrainians and their friends believe that Russian assets held in central banks and other places should be a very important part of funding that. Because there's no reason why you sitting here in this room should be footing most of the bill when Russia has caused all of the destruction. It also means that Ukraine has been adaptive. It's adapted to situations. It has developed new segments, such as building killer drones. Ukraine is now the world's leading producer of these, some of them being produced industrially, but also there's now a kind of YouTube video-based make your own killer drone things to allow ordinary people with ordinary solder kits, home solder kits, to get working and help the armed forces. So, and it's actually changing warfare. I think those of you who've been following the writings of General McRyan, who's been a very prolific commentator, a very insightful commentator on globally, he's probably of military people, he's probably my favorite of those who comment on the war. The way that first Ukrainians, the Russians are also adapting, have taken to drones, especially FPV drones, sort of basically video game type first person drones, is changing the economics of war. You can have a drone that costs $800 destroy a tank that costs $2 million without necessarily having to invest in even a Javelin system that costs $50,000. I have a friend who runs a company called UARPA, which he describes as like America's DARPA, but with no money. It's a Ukrainian military innovation company. What they've developed is an electronic version of Javelin, NLAW, and other sort of anti-tank systems, where it basically, the weight and the thrust are all simulated. So you don't actually have to shoot the actual live weapon. And they've developed it as a portable system that can be sent out to frontline units, so they don't have to waste expensive and rare material for training, when they can get a similar sort of training and accuracy effect from an electronic version. Interestingly, uptake from Western attaches has been very limited for these ideas, because it would undermine the economics of the very expensive training procedures that many of our armies have. If you discover you can do it all tens or hundreds of times more cheaply, that requires a massive rethink. But this is the kind of innovation that's happening in Ukraine, and it will have a ripple effect in our countries as well. Part of it is dealing with the kind of war that none of us thought we'd ever have to deal with again, i.e. a large-scale land war with elements of World War I. I think people have described parts of the Eastern Front in Ukraine as the Somme with drones. Because you've got trench warfare plus super sophisticated drone elements. What it has, I think, taught the Ukrainians, and I think what other analysts are learning from this, is that you can't readily drop or forget anything from the past. If you say, hey, it's the 21st century, it's a revolution in military affairs, we're only going to do drones. Oops, no, you actually have to have infantry that deals with the very ugly trench stuff that's still happening. We're only going to do aerial. No, well, Ukraine would have a bigger air force first, but no, you can't just do that. You've got to have all the elements. Pretty much anything since the Stone Age can be activated in a wide, broad spectrum conflict like this. So that's one way Ukraine has adapted. Of course, the other way it's adapted is by using land-based missiles, including those provided by the UK and France. Thank you very much, UK and France, the Scalp and Storm Shadows, to essentially scare the Russian Black Sea fleet from the western half of the Black Sea. So that means that Odessa, which used to be blockaded, isn't anymore. And you can see from this graph, Ukraine's exports of agricultural commodities, they go down to almost nothing in March of 22. They start creeping up. This is using other ports along the Danube to get around the blockade. Then there's the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which is the one negotiated by the UN and by Western countries with Russia to agree to both Russia and Ukraine exporting grain. Then the Russians announcing we're out, starting to attack Ukrainian ports. But then by December of 2023, we are basically back at January 2022 levels. So by chasing the Black Sea fleet out of half of the western half of the Black Sea, Ukraine has regained the ability to bulk export its grains to global markets. Ukraine, Australia. Ukrainians really appreciate the help they get. Ukrainian land forces wax lyrical about bushmasters and just wish they had more of them. So whenever you're passing through Victoria, maybe make a wish, and more of these lovely units might make their way to Ukraine. Australia was an early mover. It's kind of sat back a bit in terms of on the aid side. I know that Ambassador Vincent would probably want me to tell your MPs or parliamentarians to get more active on the aid side again. But such aid, military aid as has been received, has been very effectively used by the Ukrainian forces. Ukraine and Australia are not huge trade partners, nor are they vast investment partners. In some areas, they're actually competitors. I think if you look at, Australian agriculture publications, they follow the Ukrainian grain market, not just because of an altruistic interest in how are our poor Ukrainian friends doing, it's what will the price impact be of greater or lesser supplies in grain markets. But certain things that Australia has supplied, arms for one, and coal for both fuel and metallurgy, have been essentials for Ukraine. And also, Ukrainians enjoyed the nice-to-haves they get from Australia. Australian wine, which Ambassador O'Rourke effectively promoted to Ukrainians. I find it on shelves, and even Bundaberg fizzy drinks. I think I'm not sure if it ended up in the promo. Maybe it was too frivolous, but somehow our graphic designer didn't fit it in here. But I have a picture of a supermarket shelf in Kyiv with a shelf full of Bundaberg drinks, ranging from ginger beer to passion fruit to grapefruit to etc., at a price of 109 hryvnia, which let's see, it's about 25 Australian dollar, 25 hryvnia to the Australian dollar. So that works out to about $4.50 per bottle. But somebody's buying. It's also one of these things about Ukraine that just because it's experiencing war doesn't mean everyone has become immediately impoverished and totally miserable all the time, not willing to splash out on the occasional product to make themselves feel better about having to go through the stress they're going through. And that means that you can have things that sell well, which are counterintuitive. Again, you might think, I'm producing a fairly pricey, Australian pet food, Ukraine should be the last country I should think about selling it to. Well, I dropped by a pet shop in an underground passageway near the War Memorial in Kyiv, where Anzac Day ceremonies were held. And half the pet food there was from Canada. It was all like mashed up duck taken from the purest Canadian lakes. And you think, how can this be happening? And the answer is, again, people under stress, they become even more attached to their pets. And they want to do something special. They will buy this stuff to make their pet and then thereby themselves happy. So what I'm saying is, if you happen to be an ambitious Australian exporter, don't think of Ukraine simply as a smoldering pile of ruins, but as a place that is dynamically evolving and that has essential needs, but also has a few frivolous wants, which you might be able to satisfy as well, which will motivate people to fight better and have a better tomorrow. Now, on a more serious note, the reconstruction, both that which is currently happening, but also more importantly, the future one, requires a lot of infrastructure. And again, this is where countries like far-flung countries like Australia and Canada have a lot to offer. I know from a visit to Canada at a conference in November that two of the biggest Canadian infrastructure companies are very actively engaged on potential renewal of hydro and electrical facilities, on provision of temporary housing. And that is something I think certainly that will be financed by international financial institutions, by the World Bank, and by European Bank, others. So you would be dealing with international lenders and expected to meet international standards, procurement and delivery. The destruction of the Kakhovka hydro power dam and the draining of this very large reservoir in the lower reaches of the Dnieper River near the Black Sea has raised the question of, should it be rebuilt? And if somebody decides it should be rebuilt exactly as it was built in 1953, there is that Canadian infrastructure company ready to do it. Or do you accept that maybe Soviet-style irrigation is not where you want to be, and instead you want to focus on different forms of dryland farming or less intensive forms of irrigation? Here, I think, again, is an area where a large, dry country which has to deal with sparing water resources like Australia could very well come in handy. Ukraine has been looking to Israel for some solutions, but that Israel is tiny compared to you. And I think there's comparative advantage in knowing how to do these things at scale, which is an Australian comparative advantage. Final slide, which will allow me to fit within the 3.5 minutes left, is accession to the EU as a game changer for Ukraine. It has already largely de facto merged into the single market. The emergency provisions that the EU activated means that Ukraine has in most areas de facto become part of the European single market. That hasn't made everyone happy. Those of you who follow Ukraine more closely may have seen pictures of Polish farmers dumping Ukrainian, sort of attacking Ukrainian trucks and spilling rain onto the highway, being upset about that, but it's a fact of life. What is starting right now is a process of screening of Ukrainian legislation and regulations for compatibility with EU standards. So that means that a lot of the things that have been a bit off about Ukraine will have to be fixed and will be fixed in the next 4 or 5 years as EU accession proceeds. It also means a simpler life for those who are already in the business of Australia-EU trade, because it means that more and more of all the rules that govern trade with Ukraine will be identical to those that govern existing rules that govern Australia-EU trade. One of the results of the Russian attack and the war has been the realization by key countries in Europe, and that includes Germany and France, first of all, that it is much better for Ukraine to be on the inside of their tent than to be sort of a buffer living in this indeterminate world on the outside. So that is when, for example, we see President Macron in Kiev, and I think that'll actually be tomorrow on Valentine's Day. Hearts all round Ukraine, France. You'll be seeing also not just military and strategic announcements, you'll be seeing economic announcements. There was already, I think, the announcement last month of a big French investor buying Ukraine's third largest mobile provider from a Turkish company. So what you're seeing is core Europe, or old Europe, if you will, elites accepting the fact that buying into Ukraine, both literally and figuratively, is part of where their future is at. And with that, since many of you already deal with Western and Central Europe, economically, Ukraine becoming part of that space will just make it easier and more natural to then engage in either investment or trade, and will make my life easier because we'll have fewer complaints to deal with in the business models. That's it.
Well, thanks very much, Roman, for a wonderful talk to us tonight. Now it comes for question time, and we will inviting the people who are online to send in their questions, and we'll call for them in due course. And we've got some questions from the audience here as well. Of course, the prerogative of the President is to ask the first question. What I would like to ask, you outlined some of the devastation that the war has caused to the Ukrainian economy. But of course, war also demands a shift in the nature of manufacturing, production, and the like. And my question is, and of course, ultimately, that upscaling can actually have some benefit. We've seen what happened, for example, in the United States during the pre-war period, for example. This is a bit different in terms of the existential nature. Can you tell us what have been those impacts? Has there been a necessity to shift in production in terms of that war economy?
Yep. Oh, and I forgot to circulate my two show and tell items, which is Forbes Ukraine for the January edition, and the other one is a children's book trying to explain war to children. But there you go. We have a look at that if my answers aren't interesting enough while I speak. So yes, Ukraine was initially thinking we will get these fantastic Western weapons and we'll use them, and the Russians will crumble, and it's going to be great. That things haven't quite worked out that way. There haven't been enough of the weapons. People have been too reluctant with some to supply some of the more effective ones, and so they have focused more and more on domestic production. That requires someone who can organize and kickstart it. Ukraine had this moribund state-owned defense conglomerate called Ukroboronprom, Ukrainian defense industry, but 100 companies and a state holding company, useless. It's now appointed a very dynamic 30-something-year-old investment banker, former investment banker, Mr. Commission, as Minister of Strategic Industries, and his role, and he's been doing this for the last 8 months, is to galvanize both the private sector, which is more adaptable, and the moribund state companies, revive them to make the shells, armor the personnel carriers, and do all these other things. So it's it is very much now a priority. It means that more and more of the Ukrainian budget goes towards this. If you are, and you're correct, you are either directly or indirectly through international financial institutions contributing, Internationals are paying for about half of the Ukrainian budget. So you've got, and that's a combination of loans and grants. Ukraine is basically paying for its own weapons, those that it produces, and it is paying the salaries for its army, and that which now amounts to about half of budget expenditures. So that's kind of the reprioritizing that's happening.
Okay, so first question was down there.
Yep, that's me.
Yep.
Okay, sorry.
I'd like to say who you are and where you're from.
Yes, my name is Barryon. I work for the government right now, but that's my daytime job. At night, I'm an analyst for the Lygon Group, which is an education consultancy. So my question, as I promised, a little bit burning. So as you, first of all, this is really informative and really good presentation. Thank you very much. So you talk about they're gonna cost us billions of dollars to reconstruct, to rebuild beautiful Ukraine, and also Ukraine is thinking, and you, both parties are thinking about how they can collaborate after the war. Having said that, we learned that Ukrainian government is dealing with corruption, and corruption is deeply rooted in this government for quite a long time. And in fact, that is one of the arguments the Republican Party has been always arguing. That's why United States should stop funding Ukraine because of that. And I know that there must be a plan of that. So my question is, having known that, and we're living in democracies, so the taxpayers that hate the most thing is misuse of taxpayers' money, which is one of them is corruption. So my question is, how, in your perspective, how in the future Ukraine and the world can collaborate?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I had thought of maybe adding a slide called the C word, because Ukrainian corruption are so often mentioned in the same sentence. So Ukraine has this legacy. It has also had a very active fight against corruption and a very active civil society engagement. So compared to most other corrupt countries, Ukraine is a very public country, very transparent. Ukraine is about number 30 globally on the Open Government Index. So you can go and check what people have been doing. Every Ukrainian official has to file a declaration. People track things, who's been spending what, who's been splashing out on things they should not be splashing out on. So Ukraine has a problem, but it's also very actively dealing with it. And basically our organization is part of that too. We are, if you will, not necessarily directly an anti-corruption organization, we're an alternative to corruption organization. I.e., you got what you feel is an unfair tax rule. And you think, wait a minute, that's totally unfair, unjustified. And you get a signal from a friend of somebody at the tax office saying, you know, for just 3% of that fine, you can make it all go away. My friend at the tax office can make it all go away. But instead of doing that, you come to us, and we just basically, through boring lawyer work, grind those government officials into dust until they basically cough up the money without demanding anything from it. So I think there's also an independent anti-corruption prosecutor, there's a National Anti-Corruption Bureau, there's any number of measures being taken. The United States has 3 inspector generals who are tracking what is happening with military aid. So Ukraine is, if anything, the most transparent country when it comes to combating corruption, which should be a plus, but often in PR terms turns into a minus because it means people talk about it as opposed to covering it up.
Alex will take an online question, please.
Yeah, so this comes in from Colin Forrest, who's a councillor for the AIIA. He asked, has the economy turned to total war mode with oil production focused on producing items needed for the war effort? And I guess associated with that, what is Ukraine's path forwards for diversification?
And the answer is no, it has not shifted to total war mode. In other words, for example, Ukrainian exporters continue to manufacture spare parts for cars that end up being built in Poland or Germany. So now, whether that's the right thing or the wrong thing is a debate that's happening in Ukraine. But the fact is that if you want to maintain the economic capacity to generate revenue, if you switch to total and only war mode, you would be depriving yourself of most of your revenue streams. You would only be expending. You would not be generating positive tax revenue. So you have what is a sort of a semi-normal market economy, but with a very heavy, now increasingly heavy strategic defense industry sector.
Peter down the back.
Peter Layton from the Cretaceous Institute, and yet another Australian band in Russia, I must say. Those Ukrainians are everywhere. So a couple of questions. You mentioned the defence sector there. How would you break that up, sort of value-wise? Is it mostly the large companies or mostly the SMEs? And secondly, so after the war, it made it sound like the Ukrainian economy was gradually changing from being, if you like, focused mainly on the secondary, or sort of on the secondary sectors, and ending up more like Australia with sort of a major primary sector and a major service sector and not much in the middle.
Mm-hmm. I think it's likely to be a bit more diversified than that. One of the things that the blockade has taught Ukrainians is that relying simply on bulk primary exports makes you very vulnerable if your cheap and obvious shipping route is cut off. So there is a lot of investment happening. In fact, somewhere in that in the incomprehensible Ukrainian of Forbes Ukraine,
It's incomprehensible.
is a two-page graphic of new plants opened since early 2022. And most of them are agricultural processing facilities. So people have realized that if you do some of the initial processing in Ukraine, you reduce the bulk, you add value, and it's easier to get it out to markets than simply selling bulk grain. Oops, you're cut off. Now they've managed to reverse that largely, but it's a vulnerability, and so yeah, it's certainly services are important. Interesting. How many of you are Apple Mac owners? Have any of you used a program called MacBall to sort of clean up or organize your Mac? Okay, well then, you are you. But it's one of the world's most popular programs. It's produced by a Ukrainian product company as well. So that is part of the sort of tertiary sector there. But I think the continuing wage differential between Ukraine and the European manufacturing core will make it still a fairly attractive location for what people in Germany call the extended workbench, where basically the highest value activities happen at the center, somewhere in Bavaria, and then in the middle, stuff happens in Poland, and then lower wage stuff has been happening in Ukraine. I think they'll be gradually going up that value chain as EU integration progresses.
Time for a couple of quick questions. Graham, and can I just say, we'd love to have some questions from some women. We'd love to have some questions from people who are under my ancient age. Right?
Thank you. One can appreciate how critical the role of your office is in getting people confident that Ukraine, as a society, will look after them, and that they can function effectively in there, and thus they will support the government in the war against Russia. But how have you been able to measure the level of confidence in the community in terms of, that systems will actually work okay without resorting to the traditional corruption?
Yeah, I think hard to do, but the Ukraine gained 3 points in the latest Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, which means that both international and domestic companies and respondents evaluated things as improving. That still puts it in the sort of bottom of the second third on this, ahead of Russia, and ahead of Turkey actually as well. So that's one measurable thing, and complicated by the fact that corruption talk is so pervasive that even the former head of Transparency International told me, I don't trust the Corruption Perception Index vis-a-vis Ukraine because we've just talked ourselves into a funk about how terrible we are, that we can't actually trust our own perceptions, which is a bit strange, but still. I think as well, has been a lot and will be even more being done by European agencies that are extremely thorough. Like going through all these acquis communautaire, the EU rules, fine-tooth comb, and they are now looking not at has Ukraine passed nice laws that appear Europe compatible, which is what they've been doing for the past 5 years. At this stage, the pre-accession stage, they'll be looking at implementation and assessing and vetting implementation. So that is a large extent what I'm counting in further building confidence.
Alex, got another one online?
Yeah, this comes in from Penelope Wensley.
Who I might add is a former governor of Queensland and a former Australia ambassador to Paris or to France, amongst other things. Great to have you there, Penny.
She asked, you said that reconstruction in Ukraine is happening now. Where? Who is funding it? And what companies are involved? And are these Ukrainian or foreign companies?
Okay, so it has been largely funded over the last year and a half out of Russian assets seized in Ukraine, which have been sold, and then the proceeds have put in the budget for these, let's say, school, health center, and other reconstruction projects. They've been done primarily by Ukrainian companies. One of the issues, and it's being resolved by various foreign companies, is how do you deal with insurance? Because one of the big Canadian companies that's opening an office in Ukraine asked me, where can we find insurance? Because our European insurer won't insure our office and won't insure our staff in a wartime situation. To which I said, well, there are 3 Canadian-owned insurance companies in Ukraine. Actually, Fairfax Financial Canada is the biggest operator in the Ukrainian insurance market, and they'll probably be able to find a solution for you since they assess risk from within Ukraine. I mean, basically from an outside Ukraine perspective, it's all red lights going, don't do it, don't do it. Risk is way too much. Whereas Ukrainian market operators understand that it is manageable.
Okay, last question. Have we got any from any women? If not,
I was going to ask a looking crystal ball ahead. Is it possible that Ukraine can be part of NATO, part of Europe, or not?
Okay, certainly Ukraine has written that in its constitution, so it very much wants it. Part of Europe, part of the EU, I think that is now more or less an accepted article of faith in key European capitals. In other words, the invitation to join the EU has been issued. The negotiations to start on the practicalities of accession are starting as we speak. And as I say, I would pay quite a lot of attention to the forthcoming French visit to Ukraine, because France was traditionally very skeptical, a holdout, very oriented towards Russia as its peer partner in Europe, and there has been a massive rethinking of that in Paris. So now NATO will depend to a large extent on the US, and frankly, I think the US is a lot more confused about geopolitics right now than Ukrainians. So I think you should probably be sending, thoughts and prayers to American counterparts as they work their way through the various issues geopolitically that face.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Roman, for a wonderful contribution tonight. As they say, not just great in matter, but also great in manner and method as well. It really has been a wonderful delivery. And just reflecting on where we finished at the end there, who would have thought the Russians had managed to convince both Finland and Sweden to join NATO? They've had some spectacular foreign policy successes in relation to their behaviours, and in relation to prayers, one can't help but think of the great Lutheran theologian Martin Niemöller. First they came, and that is perhaps an injunction. And speaking personally, of course, we don't have a position as the AIIA, but if you ignore these things, they end up on your doorstep. So thank you very much, Roman. You actually do get, as a speaker, a complimentary membership of AIIAQ, and that means at least from overseas you can log in and see what we're doing. So thanks very much. Just in terms of what's coming up, we've got some interesting things coming up for those of you who are either in Brisbane or online. On the 5th of March, Indonesia's 2024 election. What does it mean for Australia? The general election, 14 February 2024, with the incumbent President Joko Widodo, is term limited, and there's a three-pronged contest. We'll see what happens with Mr. Prabowo running very heavily, strongly in the polls. That's the 5th of March. Beware the Ides of March, because Professor Shahir Hameri from UQ will discuss his recent book, The Locked Up Country, detailing the problems with Australia's COVID response and suggesting alternatives moving forward. That's on the 12th of March, always Tuesday nights, or generally Tuesday nights. On the 26th of March, back to one of our favourite topics in the Pacific, Oceania. Climate politics in Oceania, renewing Australia-Pacific relations in a warming world. Pro-Vice Chancellor of Business at Griffith University, Dr. Caitlin Byrne, or Professor Caitlin Byrne, and leader of the climate justice theme of the Griffith Climate Action Beacon, Professor Susan Harris-Rimmer, will discuss their recent book, Climate Politics in Oceania. That's the 26th of March. And on the 23rd of April, Blossoming the Alliance, Australia and Japanese Foreign Relations. Historian and political scientist Dr. Michael Vaughan will discuss the historical rapprochement between Australia and Japan and their blossoming relationship in the 21st century. And we'll add more and more as we come in the course of the year. So thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being online.